In November this year, Beijing will be gearing up for the 20th Chinese Communist Party Congress. For Xi Jinping, it is one of his party's most important gatherings. He is set to secure an unprecedented third term, cementing his hold on power and his journey to become China's most powerful leader. But a new term is hardly the first thing on Xi Jinping's mind right now. Ahead of the Congress, his problems are mounting. There is an economic crisis, there is a COVID-19 crisis, and now tensions in Taiwan. While all of this could have little impact on Xi Jinping securing a third term, it makes it hard to rule out all the mistakes that he has made. Let's start off with the first one, the Chinese economy. In China, a GDP target is sacrosanct. Once it is set, there is no looking back. The government has to deliver. It has in fact never missed a target except in 1998. But this year, China is now going soft on its GDP goal. Chinese leaders say the 5.5% GDP growth is like a guidance. It is not a hard target. What this means is China is unlikely to meet its GDP target. On the 28th of July, the Chinese Politburo convened for a high-level meeting. It called for the best possible results for the economy. But there was no mention of the GDP target. The focus was on stabilizing the property markets. And why is that? Because China's real estate market is crumbling. 10 Chinese property developers have defaulted on payments. There are protests in at least 100 cities. Just how did things get this bad? The Chinese economy is obsessed with real estate. 70% of China's household wealth is tied to this sector. Chinese citizens prefer to invest in real estate. That is because the Chinese stock market is unreliable. And this demand has led to several Ponzi schemes. First, the real estate developers pre-sell houses. Then they use the pre-sale money to fund more projects. And lastly, collect more funds from these pre-sales. The crisis soon spread to the banks. They loaned out money to these developers and they are now defaulting on payments. This led to protests as people lose their savings. So there is a slump in the property market, but that's not the only problem here. China's economy has taken a turn for the worse in 2022. The zero-COVID policy has hampered economic growth, factories have switched back to the slow lane, and job cuts are still plaguing the economy. Xi Jinping's crackdown on China's technological sector has further impacted the economy. China's national GDP target was set in March at 5.5%. Economists have since warned that achieving the 5.5% goal is not possible. They predict that the growth will be around 4%. And if this happens, it will be a first for Beijing. It has never missed a GDP target by this margin ever. For Xi Jinping, failing to reach the target would be politically disastrous. And the second problem is China's COVID-19 crisis. In the first 2 years of the pandemic, Beijing seemed to handle the situation well, but then came the highly contagious Omicron variant, one that seemed to put Beijing's COVID policies to test. Unlike the world, Beijing refused to co-live with the virus. Instead, it cracked down further with its zero-COVID policies. So Xi Jinping's solution turned out to become China's problem. Major Chinese cities were under a lockdown, and now there are fresh outbreaks in areas like Xinjiang. And the third and final problem, Taiwan. Beijing views the country as a part of its territory. Chinese President Xi Jinping has not ruled out the use of force to capture the island nation if necessary. The visit by the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has further escalated tensions. China is now holding drills in the region, as many fear that Beijing could try to seize control of the island by force. So Xi Jinping's problems are piling up at home and abroad. In fact, many are now questioning if China is entering a peak Xi period. Has the Chinese leader reached the height of his influence? No one is doubtful about the fact that Xi Jinping will secure a third term, but how he manages the economy could have huge consequences. It could influence the country's global influence and image, also the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. With me on the broadcast this minute is Winston Chow from Taipei in Taiwan. He is the former political director at Taiwan's representative office in Washington. Thanks very much for being here on the broadcast. Let me first ask you, what do you make of China's reaction to U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan? How far would you say Beijing is willing to go to express its anger?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your broadcast. In terms of Beijing's reaction to House Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, it was frankly an overreaction. And it was something we had foreseen, certainly in terms of their military activities, their economic activities. It was something I think the people of Taiwan had foreseen would come. But nevertheless, it is still an overreaction. And the reason is this. A former House Speaker, Newt Gingrich, had come to Taiwan in 1997, had met with President Lee Teng-hui at the time. During and after his visit, the Chinese did not engage in economic sanctions, did not engage in political activities, did not engage in military actions against Taiwan. So 25 years later, we have the exact same trip by the exact same role as House Speaker, but suddenly everything has changed. And we saw how the Chinese engaged in live fire exercises, how they attempted in their minds to blockade Taiwan through a series of military drills and so forth. And so I think it becomes hard to argue that the CCP has not changed, that China has not changed. And certainly this is a very troubling phenomenon, not just for Taiwan, but all democracies in the region, including India.
Right. So China's reaction on Taiwan coming when it has domestic troubles mounting. It has a lot to deal with when it comes to its economic crisis, when it comes to its COVID-19 crisis. The real estate sector, like we just outlined, has been also in a mess. How important is it for Xi Jinping to manage the economic situation at this point, given that it does influence the country's global influence and image?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, many of the activities that we've seen against Taiwan are driven partially, if not mostly, by domestic factors within China. We have to understand that China is not a democracy. When people are fed up against the government, there is no change of the ruling party. There is no elections to throw the government out. People being upset at the CCP and potentially overthrowing the government would mean the end of the Chinese Communist Party. And so therefore, there's very few mechanisms within China for people to let off steam, for them to vent displeasure, for them to hope for regime change. And so therefore, the CCP, the Chinese Communists, have to be very, very careful in terms of how they manage public opinion. And so one recurring theme that we have seen is when things get tough at home, they try to show toughness abroad. And so when we see mounting economic and social difficulties within China, this is when we see them take a more aggressive military posture, either against Taiwan or against other democracies in the region. And so this is a very troubling issue, but certainly it's an issue that all of us have to deal with together.
Right. Give us a sense of how Taiwan has viewed China's drills and its overall reaction, like you mentioned at the outset, and the general sense of the people's reaction on the ground.
Well, I think, thankfully, folks here in Taipei, I'm currently based in Taipei, are calm and there is not a lot of anxiety. I think to a certain extent, people have expected that this would be coming and that this is something that is consistent with what the Chinese have been doing against Taiwan over past decades in general, but more prominently in the past 4 or 5 years. So I think people are quite used to it at this point, unfortunately. But nevertheless, I think our military is taking these sort of aggressive actions very seriously. And so Taiwan's military has taken a whole host of exercises designed to showcase our ability to protect ourselves, our ability to defend ourselves, and our ability to deter the Chinese from engaging in any more aggressive military actions against Taiwan. So at on one hand, our society is taking this very calmly, but on the other hand, I think both our government and our military are taking this very seriously and showcasing our ability to protect our democracy.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.